Welcome back to another deep dive with Colin. Today we are going to be talking about mesh again. Strangely enough, mesh is kind of the backbone to our industry. Specifically, we had a submission to talk about thin thread. Thin thread is something that's near and dear to my heart. I was fortunate enough at my last shop to be running thin thread for the majority of the time I was there, which was over 5 years. First, we ran thin thread on click frames, Sherlocks, and then we progressed into running thin thread on roller frames, and we were able to hold very high tensions. On average, about 27 newtons on our thin thread. The prints we were able to produce were, to be a humble brag, really, really fantastic thin. In a way, you could say it rivaled high solids water-based printing. So in that statement, I hope you understand that there's so much benefit to running thin thread. However, there's also a drawback. Thin thread is a thinner thread, and as a result, it's inherently more fragile. So that's what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about the ins and outs of what thin thread is, what it looks like in comparison to standard thread. And at the end of this, hopefully you have learned something really good and you'll be able to take yourself maybe to another level of screen printing. So first thing we want to talk about is what is thin thread? Thin thread mesh specifically means that the thread diameter is thinner, very simply stated. So a standard 158 mesh will have a 64 micron thread thickness. So if you pull out your ruler or your calipers and you measure a single thread, it's going to measure on average 64 micron. Now, when you weave that together to create thread, depending on that thread diameter and the number of threads per inch, you have an opening. You have, as you look at the graphic on screen, you have this square opening, roughly square, that allows all inks, liquids, fluids to pass through. And you can see here that it's not the biggest hole opening. It looks like, wow, there's a lot of thread there. And in truth, there is a lot of thread there. That thread percentage opening is pretty low in comparison to the threads. Well, when you go to thin thread, that thread diameter gets thinner. The standard for a 158 thin thread is 48 microns, which is taking off all of 12, 16 microns, which doesn't sound like a whole lot, but when you look at the graphic on there, you can see that hole opening in your mesh, again, that space that your ink and your emulsion and water-based ink can flow through, that is now demonstrably bigger. On a normal 64 micron 158 mesh, you've got a 32% open area. That's in relation to 100% solid area. With thin thread, that's 56. That is a big increase. Why is it really nice to have a large opening in your mesh for all your liquids to pass through? One, it allows ink to go through the screen easier. If that ink can go through the screen easier, you can now use less pressure when you're pulling or pushing your squeegee to get ink to go through the mesh. Now, aside from the physical demand on your body, if you are manually screen printing, to get that ink to go through, the other benefit is when we are applying pressure to that squeegee and therefore the ink, we can get that ink to drive into the fabric. So if we're getting 1/3 to 1/2 of our ink layer into the surface of that fabric, that means that the ink sitting on top of the shirt is now less than what we really want it to be. And what that means is it makes it harder to make an opaque white print look opaque because we're struggling with some of that ink going into the shirt fiber. With thin thread, using less pressure means that more of that ink now stands on top of the shirt fibers, making a thinner ink deposit. Remember, that thinner thread diameter also means that you have a thinner stencil, which means the amount of ink going on top of the fabric is less. You can now get a more opaque print with a thinner ink deposit than you can with a standard mesh screen, thereby doing two things. One, easing up the pressure and pain on your body if you are manually screen printing, and getting a more opaque print as a result. Those are the fundamental reasons why using thin thread is to your benefit. Thinner thread, thinner stencil, thinner ink deposit. If you are using the correct amount of pressure, a more opaque print. And that, in turn, is going to equal a softer, more supple print on the fabric, one that feels more like a high solids water-based print. All of that is to your benefit. Now, the downside to thin thread. If you've at all paid attention to people talking on forums, Facebook groups, Reddit, etc., it's full of screen printers who have experienced nothing but headache and pain using thin thread. Because that thread diameter is thinner, this tensile strength on that is lower, meaning it's more prone to pop. If your shop is really dirty, if you do not take care of your tools, if you are just stacking screens and not taking much care in moving them around, thin thread is not for you, because the odds of you popping a screen randomly, air quotes, is very high. And it's not random, it's because you're not paying attention to what that mesh is coming into contact with. Do you have a burr on any of your cleaning tools? Are you not paying attention to locking it into the press? Are you taking that screen when you're done and putting it into a stack with a bunch of other screens that have stuff all over them? Are you then putting that, into an area that has any kind of roughness to it? Your dark room, etc. If you're not taking care of your mesh, it's going to show up as a mar on that thread, and then that mar is going to turn into a thread break. That thread break, of course, is going to pop your screen. And that's what you see most common, is the shops that don't yet have control of their variables like that have the most trouble. Again, I'll go back to myself and my habits. When I first started using thin thread, yeah, I saw more pops on my mesh than I wanted. What I did was I started to control my variables. We controlled where we were putting our screens when we were done. We controlled the tools that we were using to pull the ink out of our screen. We'd made sure our squeegees were dialed in. The edges of our squeegees, we no longer had them sharp. We made sure that those were rounded so they did not mar the mesh. Again, if we damage the mesh, we pop the mesh. We made sure all of our tools were dialed in. We made sure our darkroom processes were dialed in. Our scoop coater was smooth. Everything was dialed in so that we could get the most out of our mesh and the longest life of our mesh. And this became especially important when we used roller frame. We were pushing that mesh tension up to a sustained level that was right there at the top of mesh manufacturers' recommendations. So again, if we had anything out of place in our shop, it was going to pop that mesh. We didn't pop any once we made sure everything was dialed in. We did not pop any mesh until that screen had gone through 50, 60 cycles and it had just hit the end of its life cycle. That was the only time we lost mesh because we were taking care of our tool. The screen is the most important thing in your shop. The only other thing that I've left out is tension. The mesh tension of a standard static for thin thread is lower than that for a standard mesh. Putting a thin thread mesh into transit at a higher tension puts more strain on the mesh. So it's difficult for any screen stretcher to send you a thin thread screen at a good tension. But again, because you can use less pressure, you can get that screen to clear very easily. The main thing you want to remember is to always choose mesh counts that are 1 to 2 newtons in difference so that you get less mesh distortion. Other than that, print on. All right, guys, that's going to do it for another deep dive with Colin. As always, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. If you think this is going to help out one of the people that you know in the industry, share it. Leave a comment down below. I love having discussions with you guys. There's always new stuff coming around. Take care, and we'll see you in the next one.